Louisiana horror, raising leech with human flesh to sell to China for medicine. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. In the quiet heart of Louisiana, what looked like a simple farm turned out to be a place of nightmares. Behind fences and smiling lies, 15 men vanished until one undercover agent risked everything to uncover the truth. This is not just a story about crime. It's a story about greed, betrayal, and the fragile line between trust and survival. If this story moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next chilling true crime case we bring to light. Every story carries a lesson, and together, we remember. The summer of 2011 still lingers in the memory of those who lived in the bayous of southern Louisiana. The heat was heavy, the kind that wrapped itself around your body and refused to let go. Cicadas droned from the trees while the marsh grass swayed in a sticky breeze that smelled faintly of salt water and diesel. For most folks around Houma, life had been hard since the oil spill the year before. Shrimp boats sat idle longer than they should, and the price of catch had fallen. Families who had worked the Gulf for generations now faced an uncertain future. That was when a strange kind of opportunity came knocking. People began whispering about something new, something that had nothing to do with fishing or shrimping. The talk was about leeches. Yes, those slippery, blood-sucking creatures that most folks would rather never see. Word spread that medical companies overseas were paying top dollar for live leeches, supposedly for use in surgeries and blood therapy. Suddenly, in a part of the country where folks would try nearly anything to make ends meet, leech farming didn't sound so crazy. Among the first to seize on this idea was a man named Earl Lawson, though everybody called him Uncle Earl. Earl was a stocky, weathered man in his late 50s, with the leathery skin of someone who had spent his life out on the water. He had worked the shrimp boats for decades, but when the industry began to collapse, he reinvented himself. He told neighbors he had connections with research labs and buyers in Houston. With a smile and a pat on the back, he explained that leeches could be the future, and people believed him. Earl had that way about him, folksy, warm, the kind of man who remembered your kids' names and offered you a cold beer when you stopped by. Soon enough, his property out on the edge of the bayou was transformed. Where there once had been a sagging shrimp shack, there now stood a high-fenced compound with metal gates, rows of holding ponds, and barrack-style housing for workers. Earl said he was giving jobs to men who had nothing, drifters, ex-cons, down on their luck farmhands, who had wandered south looking for a chance. To the locals, it almost felt like a blessing. People called Earl a generous soul, a man who had survived hardship but never forgot to help others. Trucks came and went at all hours, carrying heavy coolers stamped with labels that read, "Lab Supplies," and though most didn't know what exactly went on behind those tall fences, the paychecks looked real, and the workers, at least the new ones, seemed grateful. But beneath the surface of this newfound prosperity, something darker was stirring. Neighbors would sometimes hear strange noises late at night, the clang of machinery, muffled shouts carried over the still water, then silence. A few shook their heads, figuring it was just rowdy workers drinking too much. Others chose not to think about it at all. After all, Uncle Earl was a good man, wasn't he? That was the mask everyone saw in the summer of 2011, a mask of kindness, opportunity, and hard work. But masks can hide more than a smile. And for the people of Terrebonne Parish, the truth about Uncle Earl's leech farm would soon prove far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. By the fall of 2011, the name Uncle Earl carried weight in Houma. To struggling families, he was a reminder that kindness still had a place in hard times. Where most men saw hopelessness, Earl seemed to see opportunity, and he shared it with those who had nothing. The workers who came through his gates were men of broken stories. A fisherman whose boat had been seized by the bank, a farmhand from Tennessee who lost his crop in a drought, a drifter from Arkansas with no family left to call. Earl welcomed them all with a nod and a place to sleep. His dormitories weren't fancy, but they had bunks, clean sheets, and hot water luxuries for men used to shelters or park benches. On Fridays, he paid in cash, folded bills handed out one by one. For men who had gone weeks without steady work, it felt like a lifeline. Earl cultivated his image carefully. He sponsored a youth baseball team, paid for new hymnals at a local church, and shook hands at town events. In photographs, he looked every bit the generous neighbor. Broad smile, weathered skin, plaid shirt tucked neatly into jeans. Pastors praised him from the pulpit, and parish leaders pointed to his farm as proof that private enterprise could rebuild what disaster had taken away. But there were details that didn't sit right with everyone. Workers seemed to rotate in and out too quickly. One month a man was there, the next he was gone without a word. Earl explained it away with a laugh. "You know drifters can't tie him down." And most people accepted that answer. Men like that often disappeared on their own, chasing rumors of oil rigs in Texas or construction jobs in Florida. Old man Whitaker, whose shack sat across the bayou, noticed more than most. He heard shouts echoing across the water on still nights, followed by a clanging sound, as though chains or machinery were being hauled in the dark. When he mentioned it at the bait shop, others waved him off. "Probably just Earl's boys cutting loose," they said. Whitaker muttered under his breath, but let it be. The security at Earl's farm raised its own questions. Tall fences topped with wire surrounded the ponds, and cameras blinked from the corners of every building. Earl said it was to protect valuable livestock and equipment from thieves, and on the surface it made sense. Yet the way his men guarded the gates, checking IDs, peering at monitors before opening, felt less like protecting property and more like containing whatever was inside. Still, Earl's reputation shielded him. He drove into town in a new truck, handed out donations, and smiled as people thanked him. No one wanted to think badly of the man who put food on tables and hope back into worn-out lives. Inside the sheriff's office, though, the picture looked different. Captain Daniel Ruiz, a seasoned investigator with 2 decades of cases behind him, had been watching Earl's operation with a wary eye. Too many names of workers had crossed his desk only to vanish without follow-up. No family checked in, no forwarding addresses, no paychecks claimed. It was as if the men had been erased. When Ruiz met with Maya Collins, an ER nurse at Terrebonne General, the puzzle grew darker. She described laborers who came in pale, weak, their arms marked by odd circular wounds. Within days, someone from Earl's farm collected them, and they never returned. "It's like they evaporated," she said, the words chilling Ruiz more than she knew. Ruiz kept his doubts quiet. Accusing Earl without proof would stir backlash from townsfolk who saw him as a hero. But in his gut, the captain felt the same unease that had nagged him for months. The numbers didn't add up. Men were disappearing, and the only common thread was Earl Lawson's leech farm on the edge of the bayou. By October, the shipments leaving Earl's compound had grown larger, loaded into coolers marked lab supplies, and bound for Houston. Every time a truck pulled out, Earl threw a cookout, piling ribs and corn on paper plates, handing out beer with his easy laugh. The men ate, grateful, never questioning why the gates locked so tightly behind them at night. Houma saw a philanthropist. The sheriff saw a question that refused to be answered. And the bayou, silent and patient, held its secrets under the dark water, waiting for the truth to surface. Captain Daniel Ruiz had learned long ago that the most dangerous criminals rarely looked like villains. They looked like neighbors, coaches, choir members, the people you waved to at the grocery store. Earl Lawson fit that mold perfectly. Every time Ruiz passed him in town, the man's broad smile and easy charm made it hard to picture him as anything but a hard-working Southerner who had caught a lucky break. But Ruiz's instincts whispered otherwise. He began quietly gathering threads, piecing together a picture that no one else seemed willing to see. In late October 2011, he drove out to the edge of the bayou under the pretense of visiting Old Man Whitaker. From Whitaker's porch, with its leaning posts and rocking chair that creaked with every movement, Ruiz had a clear line of sight across the water. Earl's compound rose out of the marsh like a fortress, floodlights mounted high, cameras blinking red, fences taut with wire. Whitaker, chewing on the stem of a pipe, muttered that it looked more like a prison than a farm. Ruiz couldn't disagree. That night, as they sat in the sticky silence of the Louisiana dusk, a strange sound drifted across the water. First it was the whir of a motor, then the metallic screech of a pulley straining under weight. Moments later came something else short. Sharp cries that seemed human but were muffled, swallowed by the swamp air. Ruiz felt the hair rise on his arms. Whitaker just shook his head. Heard it before. Folks say it's nothing. I ain't so sure. Back at the sheriff's office, Ruiz pulled old missing person files, focusing on men last seen in Houma over the past year. A troubling pattern emerged. They were all drifters, temporary laborers, strangers to town. None had family close by, and none had returned to shelters where they'd once been listed. One by one, they had vanished into thin air. He laid the files across his desk, 15 in total, and stared at them until the edges blurred. 15 men, 15 disappearances, and each had come to Houma, looking for work after the oil spill. The coincidences were too many. Ruiz knew he needed eyes inside, but planting an undercover operative in a place as tight-knit as Houma was tricky. Outsiders stood out, and Earl was no fool. That's when a name came up. Nate Parker, a former Marine who had returned from Afghanistan not long before. Nate had been working odd jobs around the parish, never staying in one spot too long. His military background made him disciplined, and his drifting made his cover believable. Ruiz reached out, explaining only what was necessary. Before sending Nate in, Ruiz gave him the same warning he'd given every undercover he'd ever deployed. You're going into a cage, son. Don't mistake a smile for kindness. Keep your eyes open, keep your story straight, and don't trust anyone who shakes your hand too hard. Meanwhile, a young reporter named Kelly Huang was chasing her own story on migrant laborers after Hurricane Katrina and the BP spill. She stumbled across families searching for missing brothers and sons. One of them, Lena Parker, said her brother had taken a bus from Tennessee to Houma in July, chasing word of good pay. His last call home had been from a number traced to Terrebonne Parish. After that silence, Kelly began digging, unaware that her trail and Ruiz's investigation were converging on the same man. As Ruiz pressed further, he noticed Earl's financial patterns didn't add up. Bank records showed steady cash deposits but no loans or credit lines, unusual for a business that size. It meant most of Earl's transactions were off the books, untraceable. Ruiz began to suspect there was a middleman, a buyer, who took shipments from Earl's compound and funneled them out of Louisiana. In mid-November, Ruiz sat in his office reviewing traffic camera footage when something caught his eye. A refrigerated truck left Earl's farm at 2 a.m., its rear doors stamped with the logo of a shipping company based in Houston. Ruiz made calls, but the paper trail dead-ended. The cargo was always listed as biological supplies, destined for a warehouse near the port. Beyond that, nothing. His frustration grew. Earl's public image was thick armor, and without solid evidence, Ruiz risked more than his career. Still, the unease gnawed at him. Something was happening behind those fences, something no barbecue or church donation could disguise forever. The turning point came one damp November evening when Maya Collins, the ER nurse, phoned him directly. She had just treated another laborer with the same strange, circular marks, faint scars that looked disturbingly like bites. The man was pale, shivering, his blood pressure dangerously low. She wanted to run tests, but before she could, 2 of Earl's men showed up, signed some papers, and wheeled him out. "Captain," she whispered, "I don't think I'll see that man again." Ruiz pressed the receiver tight against his ear, listening to her steady breathing. His decision was made. The time for patience was over. Within days, he had authorization for an undercover operation. Nate Parker would be the bait. Walking into Earl's farm as another desperate drifter looking for a paycheck. Ruiz knew it was risky, maybe the riskiest move he had ever ordered, but he also knew the truth about Earl Lawson's farm would never come from the outside. It had to be uncovered from within. The morning Nate Parker walked up the gravel road to Earl Lawson's compound, fog clung low over the marsh. Cypress trees stood like sentinels in the mist, their roots twisted into the black water. Nate carried a worn duffel bag on his shoulder, dressed in faded jeans and a denim jacket that smelled faintly of gasoline props for his cover story as a drifter from Kentucky chasing work. The gate loomed ahead, tall and wired, with cameras perched like watchful birds. 2 men waited by the entrance. One was heavyset, with a shaved head and a chew in his lip. The other, lankier, wore a cap pulled low. Their eyes flicked over Nate with the suspicion of men trained to look for lies. "You looking for work?" the heavy-set one drawled. "Yeah," Nate said, his voice steady but plain. "Heard Lawson's hiring. Just need a bed and a paycheck. Don't care what the work island." The lanky man spat into the dirt, then buzzed the intercom. A few moments later, the gate rattled open. "Boss'll want to see you first." Inside, the compound was larger than Nate expected. Rows of ponds stretched out in neat grids, each rimmed with planks and covered in a thin film of algae. The air smelled of mud and something metallic. To one side stood a row of barracks with peeling white paint, smoke curling from a chimney where breakfast was being cooked. Beyond that, a warehouse sat with its doors shut tight, the hum of machinery faintly audible. Earl Lawson emerged from a small office near the center of the yard. He wore his usual plaid shirt tucked neatly into pressed jeans, a belt buckle gleaming at his waist. His smile was wide, but his eyes measured Nate carefully, the way a dealer sizes up a new player at the table. "Where you from, son?" Earl asked, gripping Nate's hand firmly. "Kentucky," Nate said, letting his accent come through. "Family's gone. Debt on the farm too heavy. Figured I'd head south and see if I couldn't find work." Earl's smile deepened, though it didn't quite touch his eyes. He clapped Nate on the shoulder. "Well, you found the right place. Work's dirty, but it pays. You follow the rules, you'll eat well and sleep safe." The words were kind, but in Nate's ears, they sounded like a lock clicking shut. He was shown to the barracks, where about 20 men were already up and moving. They looked like a mix of drifters, ex-cons, and weary laborers. Most greeted Nate with nods but little curiosity. Turnover was high, and new faces weren't unusual. They shared cigarettes, swapped stories, and moved with the slow rhythm of men who had stopped expecting much from life. That first day, Nate was given boots and gloves and led to one of the ponds. The task seemed simple. Scoop buckets of chopped pig offal into a steel cage, then lower the cage by pulley into the murky water. Within seconds, the surface rippled, then boiled, as swarms of leeches writhed and clung to the meat. The sight was grotesque, the sound worse, a wet, sucking chorus that made Nate's stomach tighten. The others carried on casually, talking and joking as though it were no different than feeding livestock. Earl appeared often during feeding time, arms folded, expression unreadable. Occasionally, he offered a brief word of praise, and the men straightened instantly, grateful for the rare acknowledgement. Nate noted how much weight Earl's approval carried, and how quickly the men sought it. That evening, Nate sat on his bunk, listening to the chatter around him. Men joked about the heat, cursed the mosquitoes, and argued over cards. But beneath the banter lay resignation. None of them spoke of plans beyond the compound. When Nate asked casually how long they had been here, answers were vague. "A couple months. Long enough." And when he asked about men who had left, silence fell like a curtain. Later, Nate stepped outside for air. The night was thick with humidity, frogs croaking across the marsh. From the warehouse came a low hum, followed by the grind of machinery. Then, faintly, he thought he heard a muffled cry. He froze, listening. The sound vanished, replaced by the whir of a motor winding down. The heavy-set guard from the gate appeared, lighting a cigarette. "Best get used to the noises," he said, exhaling smoke. "Swamp plays tricks at night." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Nate forced a laugh and returned inside, but unease gnawed at him. Every instinct screamed that he was walking a tightrope above something deadly, yet he had no choice. If he pulled back too soon, Ruiz would never get the evidence they needed. If he stayed too long, he might join the ranks of the men who had moved on without a trace. Lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, Nate thought of Ruiz's warning. "You're going into a cage." The words felt truer than ever, and he knew the lock had already turned. Over the next week, Nate learned the rhythm of Earl Lawson's farm. Mornings began before sunrise, the clang of a bell jolting men awake. They lined up in the mess hall, where a cook served grits, eggs, and thick toast. Earl appeared each morning, mug of coffee in hand, asking after sore backs, cracking a joke or two. The men laughed, their spirits lifted by his presence. To them, Earl was comfort. To Nate, he was control. Every gesture, every pat on the shoulder, every smile kept the men tethered. They weren't just working for him, they were depending on him. After breakfast, crews split into groups. Some cleaned barracks, others repaired nets or pumps. Nate's group fed the ponds. By the third day, he no longer flinched when the water erupted, leeches swarming the cages of pig offal. What struck him wasn't the grotesque sight, but the way the men treated it as routine. Earl often stood by, silent, arms folded. A single word of praise from him made the workers straighten with pride. One afternoon, Nate caught Earl's eyes lingering on him. For a moment, the genial mask slipped, revealing something colder. Then the smile returned, and Earl clapped Nate's back. "You're strong. Kentucky must raise tough boys." The words were casual, but the chill in Nate's gut lingered. The rules of the farm were clear, though never spoken. No one left without permission. Nights meant locked doors. Questions about missing men weren't asked. Nate learned quickly when he inquired about a vanished bunkmate. An older worker muttered, "Don't ask. Folks come and go," before turning away. Gratitude made the men pliant. After years of hunger and rejection, a hot meal and steady pay felt like grace. Earl exploited that need with practiced ease. At night, Nate stayed alert. Guards paced the perimeter, flashlights sweeping arcs across the yard. Once he saw Earl emerge from the warehouse, speaking in low tones as two men loaded a heavy crate onto a truck. It idled briefly, then rumbled off toward the highway. Nate memorized every detail, resisting the urge to record too soon. The signs of disappearances were subtle but constant. Boots left behind, a jacket folded neatly, bunks stripped bare overnight. Each absence passed in silence. The men adjusted, as though the missing had never been there. During a card game, Nate overheard Carter Mills whisper to the gate guard. Snatches of conversation reached him. "Another shipment Friday. Lawson wants it ready by midnight. Truck from Houston, same as before." Confirmation of Ruiz's suspicions, yet not enough to break the case. Pressure pressed down on Nate. Every smile, every nod of gratitude was a mask he wore to survive. He studied Earl relentlessly, looking for cracks. The man was skilled, his voice warm, his laughter easy, his presence magnetic. But now and then, Nate glimpsed the predator behind the charm. One night, drifting toward sleep, a faint cry cut the silence. It ended abruptly, replaced by the grind of a winch. Nate lay still, heart hammering. By dawn, the sound was memory, and across the aisle a bunk lay bare, sheets gone. No one spoke of it. At breakfast, Earl moved among the men as always, pouring coffee, grinning, reassuring. The missing worker's name was never mentioned. Nate swallowed his food with effort, anger smoldering under his calm. He wanted to act, but he remembered Ruiz's warning. Timing was everything. And the time was drawing near. The days that followed pressed down on Nate like the swamp air, each one a test of patience and control. His tiny camera, stitched into the lining of his jacket, caught fragments when no one was watching, feeding frenzies, midnight trucks, the faces of Earl's lieutenants. But the farm itself seemed engineered to erase evidence. Every trace of a missing man disappeared within hours. Bunks stripped, belongings removed, names swallowed in silence. It was the precision that unsettled Nate. Real barracks carried the clutter of men-forgotten socks, carved initials, poker debts scratched into bedposts. Here, nothing lingered. One morning, he returned from the ponds to find the bunk beside his freshly made up, sheets crisp, mattress bare of memory. The wiry kid from Mississippi who had slept there was simply gone. When Nate asked, Carter Mills shot him a look sharp enough to silence him. "Moved on," he muttered. That was the end of it. That afternoon, Nate slipped a hand under the bunk frame, searching for any trace the boy had existed. Nothing. Not a scrap of paper, not a single belonging. The bed was as if no one had ever touched it. The paranoia grew. Guards' eyes lingered longer. Conversations hushed when he entered. Earl's kindness never faltered, but Nate sensed scrutiny in every word, as though the man were probing for weakness. He forced himself to laugh at Earl's jokes, to play cards, to share cigarettes. All the while, his pulse throbbed with the knowledge that one misstep could end him. Ruiz had warned him, "You'll walk through a world that looks ordinary but isn't. Remember that." Now Nate understood. The farm was a stage. Every smile, every hot meal, every word of encouragement was part of a script. The men, desperate for stability, played along without knowing their final act. One night, Nate was hauling buckets near the warehouse when he noticed Earl and Roy Bowden beside a cooler on a dolly. The lid was padlocked, and a dark liquid trailed down its side. Earl barked something too low to catch, and Roy wiped the streak with a rag before pushing the dolly up the ramp. Nate angled his jacket, clicking the hidden switch. The camera lens, no larger than a shirt button, captured the scene. His chest tightened at the blinking red light, proof, however small, that Earl's farm held secrets. Later that week, tension peaked. In the mess hall, Earl sat at the head table, uncharacteristically quiet. His eyes moved slowly across the room, lingering on Nate a beat too long. "Some of you boys," he said calmly, "don't seem to know how to follow rules. And when rules get broken, folks get hurt." Silence gripped the hall. Nate felt his throat tighten. Then Earl's grin returned, broad and genial. "But I believe in second chances. Do your work, respect the farm, and you'll be just fine." The men murmured assent, and Nate forced himself to join in. But inside, nerves screamed. Had he been discovered, or was Earl merely testing for cracks? The pressure mounted. Nights were restless, every creak in the barracks a threat. Nate began mapping the place in his head, the camera blind spots, guard rotations, shadows deep enough to hide in. He needed not just evidence, but a way out. One evening, lantern light spilled from a crack in the warehouse siding. Nate crept close and glimpsed Earl and Carter hunched over a ledger. Carter flipped stacks of bills, while Earl traced neat columns of numbers with his finger. Through the wood, Nate caught fragments. Shipment. 15% increase. Houston by Monday. ITER. His pulse hammered. He raised his jacket slightly, catching the grainy image of Earl's bent head and the ledger on the table. It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough to link the farm to something bigger. But when he slipped back into the barracks, his duffel bag was open, clothes disturbed. Nothing missing, everything touched. A warning. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, sweat clinging to his skin. Around him, men snored, unaware. But Nate knew the walls were closing in. Earl's farm ran like a machine, erasing lives with clinical precision. And unless he chose the right moment to strike, Nate feared he'd be erased next. By early December 2011, the air in the bayou had turned cooler, the sweltering weight of summer finally loosening its grip. Mosquitoes thinned, nights carried a sharper bite, and the compound hummed with unusual energy. Earl Lawson announced a celebration, a feast for his men to mark their success and the arrival of a major shipment bound for Houston. The news set the workers buzzing. They were rarely treated to anything beyond the daily meals, and the promise of roasted chicken, fresh fish, and liquor was more than enough to lift spirits. Men spoke of it for days, their voices eager in the mess hall and barracks. To them, it was proof that Uncle Earl cared. To Nate Parker, it was a warning. Predators often offered comfort before the strike. A feast on the eve of a shipment felt less like gratitude and more like a ritual. Preparations began 2 days in advance. Earl's lieutenants, Roy Bowden, Carter Mills, and Bubba Landry, oversaw crates of meat, sacks of potatoes, bottles of whiskey. Nate helped haul supplies, noting how many cases of alcohol were stacked away far too much for a simple gathering. The night before, he sat outside the barracks as men joked and laughed louder than usual, the smell of wood smoke drifting from a pit being dug at the edge of the yard. For a brief moment, Nate felt the pull of belonging, the rare comfort of fellowship. Then he noticed Earl watching him from across the compound. The man's smile was practiced, his eyes sharp. Nate looked away quickly, dread coiling in his chest. The feast arrived. Long tables were set beneath strings of bulbs, their glow soft against the winter air. Trays of roasted chicken, pork, and fried catfish lined the tables, bowls of greens and cornbread beside them. Whiskey bottles gleamed in the light. Earl, dressed in a crisp shirt and bolo tie, moved like a master of ceremonies, raising his glass. "Tonight we celebrate you," he declared. "Without you, none of this would be possible." The men cheered, clinking bottles, music crackling from a radio. For a while it felt like a holiday in small-town Louisiana. But Nate's eyes kept drifting to the whiskey. In some glasses, faint residue swirled, clinging before sinking. Sedatives. He lifted his drink, tilted it to spill onto the dirt, and pretended to swallow. Around him, men drank eagerly, laughter echoing across the yard. Earl moved among them, topping glasses, grin unchanging. Minutes passed before the first man swayed on his feet. He chuckled, tried to speak, then collapsed. Another followed, then another. One by one, bodies sagged across the tables, breaths heavy. The yard grew quiet. Nate let his body go slack, cheek against the table. Through a slit of vision, he saw Earl step back, mask gone. The genial air was replaced by cold command. He nodded to his men. "Load them up." Roy and Carter checked pulses, dragging bodies toward the warehouse. Bubba hefted two at a time, their boots scraping dirt. It was precise, practiced, like a drill repeated many times before. A guard gripped Nate's shoulder, tugging his arm. He kept limp, steadying his breath. Beneath his shirt, his fingers pressed against the panic transmitter hidden at his chest. One press, and the signal would race to Ruiz and the team waiting in the trees. Timing mattered. Too soon, and the mission could fail. Too late, and he'd end up behind those warehouse doors. The guard bent to haul him upright. Nate pressed the button. A faint vibration confirmed the signal. Unaware, the guard dragged him toward the warehouse, its doors yawning open under lantern light. Rows of steel cages gleamed inside. Nate stayed limp, but his mind raced. The trap had been sprung not just for the workers, but for Earl himself. And somewhere beyond the fence, Ruiz and his men were already on the move. The guard dragged Nate across the yard, his boots scraping over the gravel as the compound lay in eerie silence. Only minutes before, the place had been filled with the sound of laughter and music, men clinking glasses under strings of bulbs. Now, bodies slumped across tables and benches, their breaths heavy with the weight of drugged whiskey. The scent of roasted meat lingered, mixed with the sharp tang of liquor spilled onto the dirt. The doors of the warehouse groaned open, and a wash of lantern light revealed rows of steel cages, their bars damp and stained, their floors too clean in some places, too dark in others. Nate's body was dropped roughly against the packed earth, his head rolling to the side as he forced himself to stay limp, eyes barely slitted. Earl Lawson entered with calm strides, the easy smile gone from his face, the bolo tie at his chest, catching the light as he moved like a man in charge of a factory line. "Start with these three," he told Roy and Carter, pointing toward a cluster of unconscious workers. His voice was steady, without a shred of doubt or hesitation. Roy dragged one man by the arms, Carter hauled another, and Bubba Landry lifted a third with frightening ease, carrying him as if he were nothing more than a sack of grain. The routine was smooth, rehearsed, the work of men who had done this before. Nate's chest pressed against the transmitter hidden beneath his shirt, the faint vibration he had felt earlier telling him the signal had gone through. Somewhere beyond the tree line, Ruiz and his men were moving, but Nate knew they needed time to reach the compound. Until then, he had to remain still, to keep up the act. Earl paced the warehouse with hands behind his back, checking locks, running his fingers along the bars, tapping the cooler stacked in the corner. "By morning," he said in a level tone, "we'll be clear. Houston pays double for this run. After that, we bring in fresh hands." Carter chuckled and wiped the sweat from his forehead, muttering that no one was ever going to find out. Earl's lips curled into a thin smile as he replied, "Nobody ever has." The low rumble of an engine outside rolled into the compound, and Nate stiffened inwardly. He listened, heart pounding, as brakes hissed and a truck backed up to the warehouse doors. The rear swung open, releasing a gust of refrigerated air that carried the smell of ice and disinfectant. A driver in a cap jumped down, and Earl greeted him with a firm clap on the shoulder. "Right on time," he said, his tone almost cheerful, like a man receiving a long-expected guest. Nate kept still, but his mind was racing. Was this the buyer, or had Ruiz finally arrived? The answer came seconds later when another sound cut through the bayou night, a deeper thrum, multiple engines closing in fast. Nate recognized it instantly. Tactical units. His pulse surged, but Earl and his men remained oblivious. "Load the cages," Earl ordered sharply, and his crew obeyed. Roy and Carter hauled limp bodies toward the truck, while Bubba stooped and hooked his arms under Nate's shoulders, grunting as he tried to pull him up. Nate kept his body slack, breathing slow, forcing every muscle to remain loose, even as adrenaline screamed for him to act. The moment stretched unbearably thin, and then the darkness shattered. Floodlights blazed over the compound, beams cutting across the yard. Engines roared, tires bit into gravel, and a voice boomed from a loudspeaker, "Sheriff's Department, nobody move!" Chaos erupted inside the warehouse. Roy dropped the man he was dragging, Carter cursed and fumbled for a pistol, Bubba froze mid-step, and for the first time Earl's calm cracked, his eyes darting toward the open doors. Nate exploded into motion. He drove an elbow hard into Bubba's ribs, twisting free from his grip. In one smooth motion, he yanked a pair of micro-cuffs from his waistband, snapping one wrist around a cage bar and trapping the big man before he could recover. Shouts filled the air as deputies stormed in, rifles raised, boots pounding against the ground. Commands barked, men slammed against steel, the sharp clink of cuffs echoing in the cavernous space. Nate lunged toward Roy, ripping the ring of keys from his belt, then turned to unlock the nearest cage, pulling a groggy worker to safety as other deputies poured in, forcing Carter to the dirt, dragging the driver from the truck, pinning Earl flat against the ground. For the first time, Earl shouted, his voice stripped of calm. "You don't understand. You don't—" The rest was cut off as a deputy forced his arms back and snapped cuffs over his wrists. The empire he had built on fear and silence unraveled in seconds, the order and control he had wielded collapsing under the weight of flashing lights and shouted commands. Nate stood in the center of the warehouse, chest heaving, transmitter still pressed to his ribs. Around him, cages rattled as stunned workers stirred awake, their groans filling the space with a sound that was painfully human. The compound that had erased lives with clinical precision was undone at last. The cage had opened, and for the first time in far too long, freedom had entered with the night. The warehouse lay quiet after the storm of boots and shouted commands. Deputies moved through the space, flashlights sweeping across the cages, their beams landing on faces pale and dazed. Men blinked as if waking from a nightmare. Some clung to rescuers, others sobbed outright, and one young worker kept whispering a brother's name into the air. Each voice was a reminder of how close they had come to being erased. Nate guided them out one by one, muscles aching from adrenaline. A wiry kid, no older than 20, clutched his sleeve like a lifeline. Another stumbled into his arms, eyes glassy with fear. Outside, medics rushed them into waiting ambulances. Ruiz entered with the last wave of deputies, scanning the scene quickly before locking eyes with Nate. For an instant, the captain's stern face softened, relief flickering in his expression. Nate returned the nod, the unspoken acknowledgement passing between men who understood the razor's edge between success and disaster. "Secure the scene," Ruiz ordered, voice carrying authority. "Medics first, evidence team next. Nothing gets touched until it's logged." Carter Mills and Roy Baudouin sat cuffed by the wall, their faces slick with sweat. Bubba Landry slumped where Nate had chained him, head bowed. All three avoided Earl's gaze. Earl himself was calm, kneeling on the ground with his hands bound. His expression was unreadable, as though he were merely waiting for a meeting to begin. "You've got no idea what you're interfering with," Earl murmured as Ruiz approached. "I think I do," Ruiz replied evenly. He signaled two deputies, who hauled Earl upright and led him to a waiting cruiser. By the time the last of the workers were loaded into ambulances, the warehouse was alive with flashing cameras and bright yellow tape. Technicians documented every cage, cooler, and ledger. Each neat column of numbers in Earl's handwriting was another brick in the case that would bring him down. Hours later, inside the sheriff's office, Ruiz sat across from Earl Lawson in a stark interrogation room. The overhead light washed the color from Earl's face, but the man's composure remained intact. His cuffed hands rested lightly on the table, as though he were a guest rather than a prisoner. "You built yourself quite an operation," Ruiz said, sliding a folder across the table. Photographs spilled out workers pulled from cages, the ledger on the desk, the truck at the loading bay. "But it's finished." Earl studied the pictures with indifference. "You think you've stopped it. You've only slowed it down. Houston doesn't pay double unless there's a demand. Supply always finds a way." His calmness sent a chill through the room. He spoke like a man lecturing about markets, not one caught turning human lives into product. "You treated men like cattle," Ruiz said sharply. "Drugged them, locked them up, erased them. You think any jury's going to care about your economics?" Earl's thin smile faltered for the first time. Ruiz leaned closer, his tone low but firm. "We have your cages, your ledgers, your men ready to testify. You're done, Lawson, And the trail doesn't end with you. We'll follow it wherever it leads." For a moment, silence filled the room. Earl's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Behind the glass, Nate watched, arms folded across his chest, exhaustion heavy on his shoulders. He thought of the groans of men being carried out of cages, of the ledger's cold handwriting, of Earl's claim that supply would always continue. Maybe the man was bluffing, maybe not. But one truth was certain, at least tonight: the machine had been broken. The morning after the raid, mist rolled low across the bayou, clinging to the cypress knees like a shroud. Deputies and forensic teams gathered on Earl Lawson's property, their boots sinking into the soft ground as yellow tape went up around the ponds. What had once seemed like simple rectangles of water now carried a heavy silence, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Nate stood with Ruiz on the bank of the largest pond as a diesel pump roared to life, its hose plunging into the murky water. The surface churned with mud and algae, the level sinking inch by inch. A sour stench rose almost immediately, part swamp, part metal, sharp enough to sting the throat. Technicians pulled their collars high, some pressing handkerchiefs to their faces. "This is where it'll be," Ruiz muttered. His jaw was set, his voice flat. Nate said nothing. His chest was tight, his stomach heavy. Combat had shown him death before, but this was different. This was the kind of death designed to erase men entirely. Hours passed. The pumps growled, lowering the water to a black slurry of muck. Deputies waded in with poles, dragging debris to shore. Then came the first find, a scrap of cloth, faded and frayed, caught on a root. It was bagged carefully. Soon after, something pale surfaced, a shin bone, clean against the dark mud. The sight fell silent except for the churn of the pump. More followed, a rib cage half buried, a skull staring at the gray sky. Each piece was lifted gently, catalogued, bagged, marked. By noon, the count was already in double digits. Families began to arrive, drawn by word of mouth, desperate for answers. A woman clutched a photograph of her brother, her sobs carrying across the bank as technicians lifted another evidence bag. An older man collapsed to his knees when handed a battered wristwatch that had been logged as evidence. He whispered a prayer in Cajun French, his shoulders shaking. The grief was heavy enough to press down on everyone present. Ruiz moved quietly among them, offering what comfort he could, though anger burned beneath his steady tone. Beside him, Nate felt the sorrow settle deep in his bones. He remembered bunks stripped bare, nights broken by muffled cries, the silence that followed. Now the silence was broken at last, but the truth was worse than he had imagined. By late afternoon, 15 sets of remains had been recovered from 2 ponds, a grim confirmation of the number Ruiz had suspected. Some bodies were nearly intact, others reduced to fragments, but each was a stolen story. Forensic specialists worked without pause, photographing, measuring, recording every detail. Nate looked away when a denim jacket was pulled from the muck, still clinging to a skeleton beneath. His mind drifted back to the barracks, to cigarettes shared with men who had vanished days later. Their ghosts seemed to rise now with the mud. When the pumps were finally cut, the ponds lay bare, their beds scarred and foul-smelling. Earl's pride, once presented as the heart of his farm, had been revealed as nothing more than a graveyard. Reporters swarmed the edge of the property, cameras snapping, voices urgent. Ruiz kept his words short. "We've confirmed multiple victims. This was not a farm. It was a crime scene. Every piece of evidence will be pursued until justice is served." As night fell, flood lamps lit the churned earth, their beams shining over the rows of tagged evidence bags. Families lingered, clutching photos, tokens, bits of clothing. Some wept, some stood silent, their grief filling the bayou air. Nate stepped aside, the cool wind brushing his face. He drew a long breath that carried the scent of mud and decay. Relief mixed with sorrow inside him. The cages were gone, the compound dismantled, but the cost lay in front of them. 15 men who had trusted too easily, who had only wanted work and shelter, would never return home. The bayou had grown quiet again, but the silence carried memory now. And Nate knew it would never sound the same. By the spring of 2012, The case of State of Louisiana versus Earl Lawson drew national attention. Newspapers had carried stories for months about the bodies pulled from the ponds, the families who traveled from across the South, and the farm that turned out to be a trap. When the courthouse in Houma opened its doors for trial, a line stretched down the block, families clutching photographs, reporters adjusting microphones, townsfolk eager to see justice delivered. Nate Parker sat quietly in the gallery in a plain suit. He hadn't wanted to attend, but Ruiz had insisted. "You saw what he built," the captain told him. "You should see it end." The courtroom was packed. Deputies lined the walls, and at the front sat Earl Lawson. In a gray suit with his hair slicked back, he might have passed for a retired businessman awaiting a hearing, if not for the cuffs hidden under the table. His calm expression unsettled many who watched him. The prosecution opened with force. Photographs of cages, ledgers, and coolers were shown. Deputies described the raid, medics testified about the rescued men, and forensic experts detailed the remains pulled from the ponds. Piece by piece, the portrait of Lawson's farm was revealed for what it was, a machine that consumed human lives. Families in the front rows wept openly. A mother sobbed into her handkerchief when her son's jacket was displayed. A father bowed his head when a broken wristwatch was logged as evidence. Each item was another wound, reopened, but each made the truth undeniable. When Nate was called, he walked to the stand with steady steps. He recounted his weeks inside, the rigid rules, the missing men, the feast that turned into a trap. His voice stayed firm, though his eyes betrayed the weight of memory. The defense tried to shake him, suggesting the workers had been free to leave. Nate answered evenly, "Free men don't vanish in the night. Free men don't end up in cages." The words landed with a quiet finality, and the families nodded. At last Earl took the stand. The room hushed. He spoke in a low, measured tone, not looking at the families, only at the jury. "I gave those men food, shelter, wages. They came because they wanted to. After that, it was business. Supply and demand. Nature has its way." A gasp rippled across the room. Ruiz's jaw tightened. The judge rapped his gavel, but the chill of those words lingered. The prosecutor pressed. "You used men as feed, disposed of them in your ponds. Do you deny it?" Earl's lips curled faintly. "I admit nothing. I only regret that I didn't finish the last shipment." The cry of anguish from the gallery had to be restrained by deputies. But the jury had seen enough. Testimony continued for days, but the defense grew weaker. No claim of scapegoating could erase the evidence. In closing, the prosecutor's voice carried. This was not business. This was murder disguised in the language of commerce. And every victim deserves justice. When the jury returned, the air was so heavy it seemed to press on every chest. The foreman read aloud, "Guilty on all counts: murder, unlawful confinement, conspiracy, and abuse of human remains." Families broke down, some in sobs of relief, others in grief no verdict could mend. Nate closed his eyes, a long breath escaping, a burden lifting slightly. The judge delivered the sentence. "For your crimes, this court sentences you to death." Earl did not flinch. He sat with lips pressed thin, as if he had expected this end. Deputies took him away, his composure intact, but his empire gone. Ruiz leaned toward Nate as the families embraced in the gallery. "Justice doesn't heal the wound," he said quietly, "but it keeps the wound from spreading." Nate nodded, watching the mixture of tears and relief, knowing justice had come, but knowing too that 15 names would never be called again. When the verdict was read and Earl Lawson led away, Houma seemed to exhale, but the air carried more sorrow than relief. The trial had ended, yet its shadow lingered across the parish. In coffee shops and church halls, people spoke in low voices about the farm, about the ponds, about how horror had existed so close without anyone knowing. The sheriff's office moved quickly to erase the physical traces of Lawson's empire. The compound was guarded until demolition crews arrived. Weeks later, bulldozers leveled the long barracks where men had slept. The warehouse with its cages came down beam by beam, and finally the ponds were drained and filled with truckloads of clay. What had once been presented as orderly farmland was reduced to raw earth, scarred and bare. For days, locals drove out just to see it gone. "Hard to believe what was under there," one man said quietly to his neighbor. Parents held their children close, warning them never to trust too easily, never to follow promises that sounded too good. A memorial service was held in the parish church, the pews crowded shoulder to shoulder. Photographs of the 15 men were displayed at the altar, some in color, some yellowed with age. Candles burned beneath them, their flames trembling as hymns echoed through the rafters. Families spoke through tears, grateful for answers after months of silence, even as grief choked every word. Nate sat in the back pew, hands clasped, head bowed. He had faced combat before, but the sorrow in that sanctuary pressed heavier than any battlefield. Reporters waited outside, but most families refused to speak. Their stories had been stolen once, and they would not give them away again. What mattered was that their sons, brothers, and husbands were finally remembered as more than statistics. In the weeks that followed, Nate returned to his apartment near Baton Rouge, trying to settle into routine. But the compound followed him. At night he saw bunks stripped bare, whiskey glasses with residue clinging to the bottom, the sound of a winch groaning in the dark. He heard the laughter of men over cigarettes, men who had never lived to see another morning. Ruiz called one evening. "You did good work, Nate. Not many could have walked that line as long as you did." Nate thanked him, though the words felt hollow. Good work did not bring the dead back, nor erase the image of families clutching photographs in courthouse hallways. Restless one weekend, Nate drove back toward Houma. He parked at the edge of the cleared lot where the compound had stood. The ground was uneven, wildflowers already sprouting among weeds. To a passerby it looked ordinary again, just another patch of bayou soil, but Nate knew better. He sat with the engine off, listening to cicadas hum, the air heavy with memory. He thought of Earl's words about supply and demand, about opportunity, cold, empty words that tried to strip humanity away. Yet here, among weeds and the slow return of life, Nate felt a different truth. Evil could erase lives, but it could not erase memory. And memory itself was resistance. When he returned home, he sat at his desk and wrote down each of the 15 names in a notebook. He had memorized them from the service, from records, from the whispers of families who spoke them through tears. One by one, he etched them in ink. When he finished, he closed the notebook and set it on a shelf. Justice had been served, but it was not the end. It was a reminder, a guardrail against forgetting. The compound was gone, but the community had learned to hold tighter to one another, to remain wary of false promises. Nate leaned back and stared into the quiet night beyond his window. The bayou would heal as land always did, but for him, the silence of Houma carried an echo that would never fade. The months after the trial stretched out like a restless summer. Nate Parker tried to return to the rhythm of life in Baton Rouge. Morning runs, coffee at the corner diner, afternoons fixing up his apartment, but the quiet no longer felt like peace. Every silence carried echoes, boots scraping gravel, muffled cries in the night, cages locking shut. He had left the compound, but the compound had not left him. Nights were the worst. Sleep came in broken fragments, haunted by dreams of floodlights and ponds swallowing men whole. More than once, he woke drenched in sweat, whispering the name of someone already gone. On his desk sat the notebook with 15 names. Some nights he opened it, tracing the letters as if touching the men again. Other nights he left it closed, afraid the weight of memory would crush the fragile calm he had managed. Friends noticed his distance. A waitress at the diner asked why he never smiled anymore. His landlord muttered he seemed jumpy, like expecting trouble at the door. Nate brushed them off, but inside he knew he still carried the ghosts. Ruiz called once a month. "Don't let it eat you alive," he told Nate during a late-night call. "You did what you had to. They get to be remembered because of you." Nate listened. But when the call ended, he sat in the dark staring at his hands, remembering how light the rescued men had felt in his arms, as though part of them was already gone. One afternoon, Ruiz showed up at his door with a 6-pack of beer. "Thought maybe you needed company," he said. They sat on the porch as the sun sank low, cicadas humming in the heavy summer air. "You ever think about it?" Nate asked finally. "All the time," Ruiz admitted. "Some cases stay longer than others. Lawson's will stay forever. But you learn to carry it without letting it hollow you out." Nate stared at the street. "Feels like if I stop thinking about them, they'll disappear again, like Lawson wins." Ruiz shook his head. "Remembering isn't the same as living inside it. You honored them. You wrote their names. You stood in court and told their story. That's what Lawson never could. He never saw them as people. You did. That's the difference. The words didn't erase Nate's burden, but they gave him a small space to breathe. They finished their beers in silence, the cicadas filling the air. In the weeks that followed, Nate began small steps. He volunteered at a shelter, serving meals to men with tired eyes and calloused hands. He listened more than he spoke. Somehow it eased the ache, turning grief into action. One evening, after the shelter closed, he walked home beneath the street lamps. The air smelled of jasmine, and for the first time in months, the quiet felt gentler, not heavy. Ruiz's words came back to him: carry it without letting it hollow you out. Maybe that was the way forward. Back at his apartment, he opened the notebook again. He read the names not with dread, but reverence. They were gone, but not erased. As long as he breathed, they would be remembered. He closed the book, set it on the shelf, and stood at the window. Baton Rouge glowed with streetlights and distant traffic, children's laughter echoing faintly from the sidewalks. Life moved forward, unrelenting, and perhaps it was meant to. For the first time, Nate felt the weight on his chest shift, not gone, but bearable, and with that came the faintest glimpse of peace. The storm came without warning. By late August of 2012, Louisiana's summer had been long and heavy, the air thick with heat and the constant hum of cicadas. That night, as Nate Parker sat at his kitchen table staring at the closed notebook of names, thunder rolled low across the horizon. Within minutes, rain battered the windows, fierce and unrelenting, as if the sky itself had decided to cleanse the earth. He rose to the window, bracing his hands on the frame, watching lightning split the night. Each flash lit the street outside, trees bowing under the wind, water rushing along the gutters. The storm carried a violence that felt too familiar, like the raid, like the pounding of his own heart, as he pressed the transmitter on that dark night months ago. Unable to sit still, he threw on a rain jacket and stepped outside. The downpour drenched him instantly, cold water soaking through to his skin. He walked aimlessly, boots splashing in rising puddles, until his feet carried him to the levee. The Mississippi surged high, lightning jagging across its surface, thunder following hard on its heels. Nate climbed the slope and stood in the rain, staring at the dark, swollen current. The storm dragged everything back: the cages, the cries, the smell of mud thick with loss. He thought of the 15 men who had trusted too easily, of their sudden absence, of Earl Lawson's voice still echoing. Just business, supply and demand. Anger broke loose. Nate shouted into the storm, his voice raw, words torn away by wind and rain. He cursed Lawson, cursed the cruelty that had reduced men to numbers, cursed himself for not stopping it sooner. The storm hurled his voice back in noise, leaving him shaking and spent. Then, through the roar of the river and the hammer of rain, another truth surfaced. The men were gone, but they had not been erased. He had written their names, spoken them, carried them. That was more than Lawson ever gave. Memory had survived, and memory was stronger than the man who had tried to bury it. Nate dropped to his knees on the levee, rain streaming down his face. For the first time since the raid, he let himself cry, openly and without restraint. Tears and rain mingled, until he could no longer tell one from the other. And in that breaking, something shifted. The guilt didn't vanish, but it eased, no longer crushing but resting as a scar he could live with. When the storm finally began to weaken, Nate rose slowly to his feet. The rain eased to a steady drizzle, the wind fell to a sigh, and the river rolled on, swollen but steady. He turned back toward home, exhausted yet strangely lighter. In his apartment, he toweled off and sat at the desk. The notebook waited. He opened it, the inked names sharp on the page. He whispered each one aloud, not as a weight but as a promise. When he closed the book and set it back on the shelf, he felt the quiet differently. Not heavy, not hollow, just quiet. Outside, the storm clouds drifted east, leaving the air cool and clean. The streets glistened under the street lamps, washed of dust and heat. Nate leaned back in his chair, breathing slow. The storm had not erased the past, but it had shown him a truth he needed. Moving forward did not mean forgetting. Survival was not betrayal. Memory was not a prison. For the first time, Nate did not just glimpse peace, he accepted it. Weeks after the storm, Baton Rouge carried on with its noise and bustle, traffic humming along the interstate, students crowding cafes, families strolling sidewalks on weekends. Life pressed forward, as it always did. Nate Parker learned, slowly, to move with it. The notebook of names still sat on his desk, though he no longer opened it every night. It was enough to know it was there, a reminder, not a weight. Sometimes he slipped it into his jacket pocket when he walked the city, a silent pledge that the men whose names it held were walking beside him. On a cool autumn morning, nearly a year after the raid, he drove again toward Houma. The lot where the compound had stood was now overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. Birds nested in the brush, dragonflies skimmed shallow puddles. To most, it looked like forgotten land. To Nate, it was sacred ground. He stood there for a long time, hat in his hands, the wind tugging at his shirt. He thought of how evil had hidden itself here, how greed had reduced men to fodder, how a smiling lie had nearly gone unchecked. And he thought of how the truth had finally broken through courage, persistence, and the refusal to turn away. Before leaving, he bent down and pressed a small wooden cross into the soil. It bore no names, only 2 words: "We remember." Then he turned back toward his truck, the weight in his chest no longer crushing, but steady, something he could carry without fear of breaking. That night, back in his apartment, Nate sat by the window as the city lights flickered against the dark. He thought of Ruiz's reminder: justice does not heal every wound. Yet he saw now that remembrance itself could give wounds meaning. Memory could not bring the dead back, but it could keep them from vanishing. He leaned back, breathing slow. The farm was gone. Earl Lawson was gone. What remained was the lesson. Trust can be twisted, greed can hollow a man until he sees only profit, and evil often wears the mask of kindness. But against that, memory endures, community endures. And courage, even quiet, ordinary courage, can stop darkness from spreading. For the first time, Nate felt the story was not only finished, but passed on, carried forward as warning and as hope. The silence that once haunted him was now simply quiet, like the air after a storm, washed and new. He whispered one last promise into the night: "I'll remember." And this time, the words were not heavy. They were steady, like peace.